Oh, like. Потом поговорим. Doesn't work.
Okay, we're going to start this session. This is the Open Society Hub for Politics of the Anthropocene. And today we have a very unusual event. Talk by Vicente Ferraro, who came here from Brazil, stopped in Berlin. Vicente is a postdoctoral fellow at one of the best universities of Brazil called FGV. He defended his PhD in political science in the University of Sao Paulo. He's now a fellow at the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin. And he will talk about his remote ethnography of the war online, I think, for various reasons, such as pandemics and probably more reasons for that. Ethnography actually is going online, and I think that's a kind of very forward-looking way of doing ethnographic research or social sciences in general. But right now, this ethnography was not that remote because Vicente has just came back from Ukraine, where he spent several weeks, and I think he will talk about both aspects, remote and remote impressions and responses from his respondents. Please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Oh, then you can take. Pode tirar algumas fotos? Yeah, of course. And actually, I consider that it was. I went to Ukraine, but I consider that it was still remote because I wasn't in the occupation. No? So I was interviewing people that lived in the occupation, but I didn't go to the occupation. So maybe it's still a remote ethnography. So thank you very much for the presentation. I really appreciate the invitation by Professor Alexander Etkin and also to Fabio Lamper that introduced me to Sasha, and Sasha went to Brazil. We had the opportunity to meet in Brazil, so I'm really happy that now we can meet again here in Europe. So I am studying the war in Ukraine since 2017 during my PhD at the University of São Paulo. Before that, I studied during my master's degree at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. So I was there when the annexation of Crimea happened, and I could see how the Russian government was using the annexation of Crimea for self-legitimation purpose. So for me, the war in Ukraine is the continuation of the war in Chechnya. Like all the time, the Russian government, Putin's regime depended on wars to boost nationalism in society and keep like his popularity.
We also slide.
Oh.
Yeah.
So I will introduce a little about my research. Like I work with the so-called street-level bureaucracy. Now, street-level bureaucracy is the part of the state bureaucracy that deals with common people, with common citizens, like police officials, firefighters, rescuers, teachers, all the parts of the state that directly deals with citizens are called street-level bureaucracy. And in public administration, this literature started to evolve during the 80s. And there is an increasing amount of studies on street-level bureaucracy in many fields, but not in context of crisis, political violence, and wars. In context of crisis, it started to develop during the COVID pandemic, but then it halted. And I think that it's really important to understand how street-level bureaucrats work in context of wars. Which challenges and difficulties they face during this context, And the Ukrainian case is really important because we have to think about how to ensure the provision of basic public service amid a war. So it is a really tricky question. My two research questions during my postdoc are: how do wars and armed confrontations affect the performance of street-level bureaucrats? And what strategies do they employ to cope with the adversities of this context? By now, I'm focused only on the education field, but I've recently started to work also with rescuers. When I went to Ukraine, I took many interviews with rescuers, with firefighters, and with doctors, with doctors. But I think that teachers and educators, they are really interesting to understand like this context, because they have become the front line of a war that's not only material, but also cultural, also ideological. And Russians strive to control the educational institutions to legitimize the annexation of the new territory. So since the beginning of the war, education became a major target by the Russian army. Why education has become a major war target? Like, first, for cultural assimilation. Now in Ukraine, they are calling it a cultural genocide, because Ukrainian children in occupation are being taught that they are not Ukrainians, they are Russian. So it's kind of a cultural genocide, that you are trying to change their identity. Ukrainian language, Ukrainian literature and history are not being taught anymore in the occupation, and Russian is being taught instead. The political indoctrination and militarization. There are many works that show that in the occupation, there is some kind of preparation for wars. So they are being taught that they are not Ukrainians, they are Russian, and they have to fight against Nazis in Ukraine. So there are, I think, mostly the teenagers, they are being prepared to fight against Ukraine. The political legitimation, so teachers, especially in small villages, they are like community leaders. Their opinion really matters in small communities, and even in bigger communities, but especially in small communities. The sense of normality and stability. If schools are working in the occupation, you can say that life is becoming normal there, like the Russian government is working there. And last, the information about local families and citizens. Some teachers that work for Russia, they can be a source of information about if their parents are in favor or against Russia, and this can be used against their families later. So they became a political tool. I chose Ukraine because Ukraine is an extreme case, like extreme violence, extreme difficulties, and dilemmas faced by street-level bureaucrats. And these extreme cases are very useful for underexplored fields, for exploratory fields. Like I mentioned to you, the work of street-level bureaucracies in wars is an underexplored field. I also have a sub-case. I chose a region in southern Ukraine called Kherson. You probably know it was a city that was occupied from March to November 2022. And I chose the city because it was occupied, then deoccupied. So it was a big opportunity to make interviews with people that lived in occupation. I couldn't make interview with people that now are living in occupation for ethical reasons. They could be in danger. So I think Kherson is a good case. It's a unique opportunity for greater security and reliability in data collection. My first data collection was based in official documents and reports from state agencies, from NGOs, journalistic reports, interviews, and news about educators in Ukrainian, Western, and even Russian websites. And then I codified this in the app NVivo. And then I sent the research to the Ethics Committee of the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in 2024. I sent them the questionnaires, the interviews in terms of consent in Ukrainian and Russian. So the interviewees, they can choose if they want the interview in Russian or in Ukrainian. All the interviews, they have to be anonymous. There are some cases, like with Matvichuk, for example. I got an interview with Matvichuk, and she's well known, and she told me that it doesn't need to be anonymous. No? But there are many people that I interviewed that they have relatives in the occupation. So they are sometimes scared and afraid that it can harm somehow their relatives. So anonymity is an important thing in this research. Then my first phase was a fully remote ethnography. I did interview 8 in-depth online interviews with educators from Kherson and 2 from Kharkiv regions, educators that also lived in occupation. Then in the second phase that I started recently, I consider it a partial remote ethnography, a field research. I went to Ukraine. I spent 3 weeks there. I've been to Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Kyiv, Bucha, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. I did there 42 official in-depth and recorded interviews and more 20 informal talks without record. The focus of these interviews was the occupation in Kherson, Mykolaiv, Donbass, Crimea, and Bucha. I've also been to some villages that were occupied in 2022, and I did the interviews exactly in the village. This was really difficult because when you work with the subject, like, you become very emotional because you listen like people that were tortured, people that suffered a lot. When I was doing it online, it was already difficult. When I went to Ukraine, like to Kyiv, it was even more difficult when you are in front of the person that was tortured. And when you go to the region that was occupied, like, for example, I was doing the interview with a director. She was threatened, and across the window I could see the school destroyed. So emotionally, it's very hard to do this research. And I could count on the help of local organizations like Resilient Ukraine, the Naukma, Kyiv-Mogilyanka University. The Embassy of Ukraine in Brazil also helped me a lot. So I had many contacts that in Ukraine that helped me to conduct this research. I met like many government officials and local NGOs, and they gave, apart from the interviews, they gave me like documents, special documents that are not available online, and these documents will also be very useful for the research. So at the first phase, I was focused only in Kherson, like making interviews, doing interviews with people from Kherson online. Like, this is a map of Kherson now. All this region was occupied too, and now the front is on the Dnipro River. And I was mostly doing interviews with people in this part that was deoccupied. But I also did interview with people from these regions that they moved to another city, like some of them are working now in Kyiv, in Odessa. So it was also an opportunity to take interviews. These are my first interviews, like some of them are school principals, teachers, and university professors. And now in the second phase that I went to Ukraine, I went to these cities. Some of the interviews. Here was the closest point to the front that I went, like, it was 25 kilometers from Kherson. Like, it's a village that was occupied for 9 months. And as I mentioned to you, like, it's nearly completely destroyed. So it's interesting that Ukrainians, they tell me that usually the parts that were closer to the front, they were more destroyed, but the parts that were in the occupation were not so harmed because the Ukrainian army avoided to reach civilian targets. And it was true because I went to some places where you could notice this is a Ukrainian area that was not occupied, it's completely destroyed. And and the part that was under occupation was not destroyed. So almost everything was completely entirely there. So the first impact of the war, like the risks to life and traumas in the occupation, the most obvious, like in Kherson, more than 800 civilians were killed, nearly 200 injured, 300 educational facilities damaged. It is around 38% of all educational facilities of Kherson. 70 of them were completely destroyed. You can see there, not only in Kherson, but also in Mykolaiv, where I was, you can see many bombs of apartment buildings completely destroyed. People told me a lot about mines and fragmentation bombs. So these bombs are forbidden according to international law, but it was a really common case, like these fragmentation bombs, they explode. Usually, like they fragment in 600 pieces, and nearly 150 pieces don't explode. And if a child take it, it can explode. It's like a mine. It's a mine that is overspread in civilian areas. Like teachers there faced emotional pressures. I think educators became like psychologists because they had to deal with the children's emotions, like how to explain to them what was happening, how they can survive under this situation. There was a teacher that told me that until now, when there is some strong sound, like a door that abruptly closed, children started to cry, thinking that it's like a messiah or something like that. So until now, even in regions that are not under attack anymore, children are suffering. Many teachers and directors that lived in occupation mentioned like the recurrent search by armed and masked Russian officials, not only on the streets, there were like checkpoints on the streets, but they also came to home and they verified like the books, what they were reading, what they were writing. They tried to check the cell phone. So almost everyone that I met that lived in the occupation, they mentioned that the cell phones were constantly checking because they want to know if you have like pro-Ukrainian message, if you were telling where the Russian soldiers were based, like to the Ukrainian army. So cell phone checkings and home searches were really common in occupation. Many people mentioned like theft, robbery, and looting by Russian soldiers, including food. So sometimes they were crossing a checkpoint with bags from shops, and the soldiers required them to give a half of the shops or sometimes even more. Some interviews mention like threatening curfews, like after 8 p.m. no one can live in the street. If you live in the street, you will be considered an enemy, and we have people in the buildings that can shoot on you. So it was really threatening to them. And another big issue in the occupation was the recurrent shortage of water, products, medicines. So many people died because the offer of medicines was not available because of the war, like people that have diabetes and have other clinical issues. They really faced the problem with the shortage of medicines, energy and gas, heating, especially in the winter. No? So this is an educational institution in Kherson. This is in Nova Kakhovka. It's a city in Kherson region. Like I interviewed the school principal of this school, and she was showing to me these pictures and crying, like, because for her it's like her house, and the school is like a house, it's like a home for her, and now her school is completely destroyed. This is an administrative building in Mykolaiv. In Mykolaiv, you can find many buildings like that, completely destroyed. So the closer you go to the front, more often you find buildings like that across the city. And I have a quotation that I thought really interesting about an interview. So he mentioned, in occupation, you could disappear and no one would search for you and no one would even know where you are, absolutely. Even if someone looked for you, it would be pointless. So you've turned it into just a thing, not even a human, not a dog, not a cat, just absolutely nobody and nothing, not worth anything to anyone. Your professional achievements, your own life are just nullified. You became zero. So people living in occupation, I think they have this feeling that if they will be killed, no one, it doesn't matter to anyone, maybe it will become just a number in the official statistics. So this was, I think this quotation was like quite representative for people living in occupation. The second major impact was the political pressures from the warring parts in the occupation. Like there were profound ethical and existential dilemmas because teachers, they became in a front. Like they had two choices: complying with the decisions of the occupying authorities, such as adapting the Russian school program, teaching Russian history, Russian language, and potentially being judged for treason in Ukraine, or refusing to collaborate with the invaders and facing risks of physical, material, and psychological sanctions. I did interviews with school principals that refused to collaborate, and they were sent like to prison during the occupation. Then I will talk more about that. Here is a quotation by the head of the Committee of Education of the Ukrainian Parliament. He mentioned, you have two options: to do as you are told, but in doing so, you will fall under the provisions of the Article 111 of the Criminal Code regarding liability for collaborationism and treason against the state, which will result in certain restrictions and temporary ban on holding positions. Actually, according to this article, you can go to prison. And the second option, do not comply with what they ask and terminate your employment relationship. The state guarantees that your position and salary will be restored when we conclude the liberation of the urban settlement. So you have to get fired and be without income and just wait for the Ukrainian troops. You can see that it's a really complicated choice. That's why I think that education is a really sad but interesting case because of these contradictions. Another quotation, like, I do not have, by the educational ombudsman, I do not have the moral right to advise these individuals because I'm not there. I cannot fully feel what they feel and think. The only thing is not to voluntarily cooperate with the occupiers and to not support them. If we are talking about coercion under the threat of machine guns, then we do not have the right to demand heroism from them. So you can see that even in the Ukrainian government, there are people that recognize that it's not a simple choice. And the third impact of the war, major impact of the war in the work of the teachers and professors, I think are the uncertainties regarding the status of the territory, like questions and expectations about the war's outcomes. So we don't know if Ukraine will win the war. Maybe the region where I'm based now will be with Russia for the next 10, maybe 50, maybe 100 years. It's very difficult to know. Huh? Questions and expectations about the use of violence by the occupiers. So now they are not threatening me, but if I continue to refuse to work for them, will they change the way they are behaving to me? Like the source of resource for maintaining the bureaucracy and its service. Will I receive a salary from the Ukrainian side? Like I will show to you later, like at the beginning of the war, the teachers in the occupation, they managed to receive their salaries from the Ukrainian government. But it was not certain if they would be able to receive it in the next months and years. No? And the last, like the possibilities of maintaining connections with higher echelons of Ukrainian national bureaucracy. So many teachers, they kept like in connection with the Ukrainian state, but at the same time, Russia was trying to cut it. Like the internet connections was all the time was being cut. They had to use VPN to access Ukrainian websites, and it was too risky. Like because if some soldier comes to your house and asks like to see your cell phone, and they see that you are talking to Ukrainian officials, you can face really strong problems. So here I have like a summary. You can find it in the paper. I have a preprint of this research. You can find like the summary of the impacts that I mentioned too. The high insecurities, the high political pressures, like the ethical dilemmas and the high uncertainties. And as I will show now, these teachers, these professionals, they developed some kind of strategies in the war. Strategies aiming to cope with the impacts that I just mentioned to you. And these strategies were mainly based on two decisions, like the first decision to remain in the occupied territory or not, and the second, the decision to directly resist the occupation or not. The adoption of each strategy takes into account complex calculations of costs and benefits, risks and trade-offs, personal values, emotions, cultural traits, and material interests. And teachers and educators in general, they were compelled to choose one of these four strategies. So here you have like remaining in the territory or not, direct resist against the occupation or not. So based in these two decisions, I made this typology, like exit, collaborationism, remote adaptation, and local defiance. I will explain shortly each of them. So exit, like the first, not remaining and not resisting the occupation, was one of the most adopted strategies. 80% of the population of Kherson left the city and the occupation. The main motivators for this strategy were that to have relatives and social networks in other regions. So if you have relatives or close friends in other regions far from the occupation, you can move there. But it's not always easy. There are many people that they don't have relatives. I found some cases of people that they do have relatives, but other refugees were already in the houses of these relatives. So it was not possible to go there. Like resources for basic living expenses, perspectives of integration, like socially and economically into the new region or country. So you need to have some kind of qualification, job opportunities. If you go abroad, you must have some basic income to survive for a while without any help. So it's not an easy task. The main the motivator. So why did people stay in occupation? Many people left the occupation, but many people also stayed in occupation. This is a big issue in Ukraine. I can tell you that there are many prejudices, like many Ukrainians think that if people stayed in the occupation, it means that they support Russia. And it's not like that. I interviewed many people that lived in the occupation. They got really offended because of this perception that's really common in Ukraine that, oh, if you are in occupation, it means that you support Russia. It's not the case. Like many people chose to remain in occupation because of lack of resource and social networks, that they do not have friends or other people in other regions, emotional ties with the territory. I don't know here in Austria, but in Brazil, I think I think it is a really Ukrainian cultural trait. I don't know if it would be some invasion in Brazil, I would not think twice to move to another region, and I would never live in occupation. But I noticed that for many Ukrainians, the place in which they were born, it's really important for them. They don't want to leave it. So it's part of the Ukrainian culture, this emotional ties with the territories in which you were born. Like disease, mobility, impairment, and physical disabilities. So many people, they had some physical disabilities and they didn't, it was not easy for them to move to another region. Or some people, they have old relatives that have these issues and they have to take care of their relatives, their parents, so they don't move to another region. Fear of Russian checkpoints and bombings. At the beginning of the war, many people tried to move from the occupation to a Ukrainian-controlled territory, and they were murdered by Russian soldiers. So crossing checkpoints and crossing the front was really risky. So many people were afraid of trying to move from the occupation to the Ukrainian-controlled territories. Fear of property confiscation in the Donbass war since 2014. People that left Donbass, they lost their house. So the new government, they just confiscated the properties. So people were afraid that they only had like their houses, and suddenly, if they leave the territory, the occupation, this property will be confiscated. And in some cases, people from Russia were invited to settle in this house. This is a really common issue. Like people that left the occupation, they lost their house, and people from Russia were like gifted with this house. And in some cases, I think this was a minority, but it was present, like the affinities to the occupiers. As I mentioned to you, there are prejudice from both sides. Like I interviewed a guy that mentioned that an Ukrainian soldier, he was crossing the front. He was like a volunteer. So he was crossing the front, going back, bringing like medicines, products, and an Ukrainian soldier told him, you support them, not you are still living in occupation, so you are not from us. You are just supporting them. And he got really offended, like, no, I don't support. It doesn't mean that I support them. And many people that I interviewed, they have relatives in the occupation. And these relatives usually tell that people there don't support the Russians. They are only waiting for Ukraine to recover these territories. So the second strategy was collaborationism. So it's remaining the territory and not resisting to the occupation. This is the most controversial strategy in terms of ethical and moral values. It was based on coercion and cooptation by the Russians. I will show you that Russians tried to use both coercion and cooptation towards these people. Like there are two kinds of collaborationism. The first, the passive collaborationism that is based on coercion and social conformity. it's driven by the fear and threat. Like, as I will show you further, there were many cases of kidnappings, interrogatories, some cases of torture, of rape. So people were afraid that if they refused to collaborate, they could face some kind of threat and even torture. It was also an instinct of survival, like maybe allow expectation that Ukraine would reconquer the territories. So the most reasonable choice would be to support Russia because probably Ukraine will not be able to come back here. And also like an indifference if like in some towns, Russia nearly didn't change anything in the town. Like just the flag was changed and the authorities, like the local authorities, were the same that during the Ukrainian government. So there were, in some cases, there were only small changes in daily life. So indifference was also a source of collaborationism. So only the flag changed here. The local authorities are the same. The active collaborationism was more based on cooptation. This is the most frequent collaborationism. It was driven by career opportunities, like Russians, they offered better posts for people that accepted to collaborate. So there are people that they were never worked as school principals, for example. They always worked as teachers. And then someone offered them, oh, do you want to become the school principal? If you join us, you will become the school principal or you will become the head of the education in this town. So career opportunity was a really used tool of cooptation by the Russian authorities. Political and material interests, like the salaries that were offered or promised to them, were much higher than the salaries paid by Ukraine. But then some teachers told me that Russia made many promises, but they didn't fulfill this promise. So many teachers, they regret that they went to collaborate thinking that they would receive more and that at the end they were cheated. Some people that went to collaboration, they also received some kind of bonus for in your first month of collaborationism, you receive like 100 rubles in dollars. I forgot how much, but for Ukraine, it's a lot of money. And there were also cases of ideological identity and cultural affinities towards the occupiers. The risks of the strategy. The social stigma, like you will be labeled as a traitor in Ukraine. The punishment according to Ukrainian criminal code. Threats and attacks by insurgent forces. So there were many cases. Until now, in the occupied territories, there are attacks promoted by insurgent forces and the Ukrainian government against the collaborators. So there is also a risk of life. And many people, when the Ukrainian army took Kherson back, these people escaped to Russia-controlled territories. In nearly all interviews, they mentioned that most school directors, they refused to collaborate. Only a minority of the school principals, the school directors accepted to collaborate. So here's a Russian flag in Kherson before the occupation. Just some interesting quotations, like here as a school director. The occupier said that if we didn't work, they would bring teachers from Russia. It was difficult for all of us to make that decision, but we decided we would cause less harm to the children than the teachers who would come from Russia. These are our children, and we must teach them. It was scary to tell the children, I used it to teach Ukrainian, and now I will also teach Russian. Scary and shameful, but the children didn't ask anything. Probably their parent explained everything to them. I think this quotation shows how collaboration is not always simple to judge. Now in Ukraine, there is a strong resentment against like collaborators, but as I show here, it's not easy to judge people. There are some situations that it's easy, but there are other situations that are not easy. Another interview, God is the judge of all. I don't want to be a judge or a lawyer. We need to analyze each case. Do you understand what occupation is? If you don't want to cooperate, they will speak with you in a more convincing manner. And here, it was a quotation from a Russian newspaper of a school director that started to collaborate. Some didn't understand what happened, and some were afraid. Fear was the main reason for non-participation, non-collaboration. Half of those who believe that Ukraine is Europe sincerely believe it. It is possible to persuade some, but others not. Half of my colleagues with whom I worked for 15, 20 years were even friends, did not understand my choice. They called me a traitor to my face. Some people from my former close circle went away. Some hid and are still awaiting the return of the former Ukrainian authorities. Many good specialists, teachers, and school principals fell victims to the Ukrainian propaganda. This is a loss for us. We miss them very much. We tried to persuade the teachers to return to work, but they hid, they were afraid. Only a few are working now. You can think that the interview in a Russian newspaper is some kind of Kremlin's propaganda, but I think that in this interview, we can get too many information. Like we can get first the information that school principals, they were not collaborating to Russia. So even in the Russian newspaper, you can find that school principals were not collaborating to the new authorities. The next strategy, like local defiance, it's when you stay in the territory and at the same time you resist the occupation. This is the risky strategy. What are the forms of the strategy? Like protests and boycotts. Russia tried to promote an annexation referendum in September 2022. And many people I interviewed, they mentioned that Russian soldiers, they were coming to their houses like with the ballots for voting, and they just hid and kept it calm, like in silence, or they went to their dachas in order to don't vote. So there was a huge boycott against Russia, a boycott against ruble, the Russian currency. So people were trying to use the Ukrainian hryvnia and avoid the ruble. The refusal of adopting the Russian school programs, as I mentioned, many directors, they refused to join the Russian schools. Parents' refusal to send their children to Russian school. So many parents, they tried to resist. Many teachers and school directors, they mentioned that they concealed school equipment, documents, and even maps. Like Russians were looking for maps of the regions, and they knew that there are classes of geography. It was in Mykolaiv. So you have the maps of the region, like the teachers of geography, they have the map of Mykolaiv, and we need these maps in order to know more about the territories where we can advance. And the teachers, they just destroyed these maps, they hid these maps in order, so they were like hiding school equipment, like computers. They were afraid of looting, because there were many cases of looting of equipment. Documents, there were parents that fought in the war in Donbass, and the Russians were looking for these people that fought in the war in Donbass. So the school teachers and directors, they destroyed these documents in order to preserve the life of the parents that fought in the Donbass war. Another source of resistance and really risk was to inform the positions of Russian soldiers to Ukrainian armies. This was really risk because Russians then they were trying like to check the cell phones, and I heard cases of people that a woman, for example, that she provided it. The Russians they found on her mobile, and she was raped after that. Like she spent all kinds of torture and even rape. And also partisans. There were people that, as I mentioned to you, like they exploded bombs in the cars of the collaborators and the occupiers. Some people that told me that until now there are people infiltrated in the occupying administration. So there are people that work for the Ukrainian Security Service that are now in the occupying administration, but at the same time they are providing Ukraine with information. The motivators for this strategy, the psychological and moral benefits, the protection against collaborationism criminal charges upon Ukraine territorial liberation, and the payment of the so-called prostoy in Ukraine. So teachers that were in occupation, they continued to receive part of their salaries. It's called like prostoy or prosti. It's called prosti. So they receive part of their salaries. And many of them told me that it was possible to receive the salary. They spent like 9 months in occupation, and they could receive it in the card, and they could use the card. There was also informal illegal markets that you could change. Like Russians, they created a corruption schema that you could change your payment from Ukraine to rubles. So it was like an illegal market. And some of them, they continued to work online during the occupation, and they received like their full wages in 2022. Last year, in 2024, the Ukrainian government, I think in April, the Ukrainian government stopped to pay the prosti for the teachers that remained in the occupation. So they are not receiving anymore. But the pensions are still being paid. Like during the Donbass war, Ukraine stopped to pay the pensions for people that were the Russian occupation. And it was considered in Ukraine some kind of treason, like Ukraine just forgot of these people. And now, after 2022, Ukraine is trying to look in a different way to these people. So they are trying to keep the allegiance of these people. They are still paying their pensions. So there are many people in occupation that are receiving an Ukrainian pension and a Russian pension at the same time. The motivators of this strategy. I think the first of all is the so-called pitval. So pitval in Ukraine, the translation is basement. Like many people that tried to resist somehow, they were sent to the pitval. They were sent like to basement. Then they had threats, risks of punishment. In some cases, people were tortured in the pitval, like with electroshocks and all kinds of, as I mentioned to you, even rape happened in the pitval. So kidnappings, interrogatories, prison, physical and psychological torture. I interviewed like 3 teachers, 3 school principals that they went they are from Nova Kakhovka. They refused to adopt the Russian school program. They were sent to the pit wall. They told to me that they were not tortured, but they were interrogated all the time by people with masked face. When they were sent to the pit wall for much time, they had like a bag in their heads, like they were in a very hot room with, I think, 6 people in a very small room. They could go to toilet only once per day. They had food only once per day. I consider it a form of torture, not only psychological, but also physical. But they could hear people being tortured, like with electroshocks not far from them. Like during the time that they went to the toilet, they met other women that were raped and tortured. So they think that their treatment was not so bad as the others. So that's why they think that they didn't face torture. As I mentioned to you, the constant search in streets and homes, the cell phone verification, checkpoints were like a social control. There were checkpoints in roads, but in the occupation, also in the cities. In the middle of the city, if you want to go from a neighborhood to another neighborhood, you have to pass like checkpoints. Another demotivator is the loss of employment and resource. If you refuse to work, imagine that you are a teacher, you are invited to work in a Russian school, you refuse because you don't want to be a traitor, but you need a salary, not? If Ukraine will not pay anymore, like Ukraine was paying the salary before, but now it's not paying anymore. What will you do? So many people, I think, are now working as a teacher again because they need the salary. No? There were many cases, like officially Russian authorities deny it, but many people I interviewed, they mentioned that collaborators, they mentioned that if the parents would not send their children to the Russian schools, they could lose the parental custody. So Russians, they tried to deny it, but many people interviewed, they mentioned that the collaborators, they came at the house of each one and told that if you don't send your children to our new school, you will lose your parental custody. Deportation. So there were people that resisted. They were just sent to the front and deported from the occupation. Many had their property confiscated. As I mentioned to you, educators were sent from other parts of Russia and from occupied Crimea. There was pressure of collaborationism by some colleagues, and it was like promoted a Russian-sponsored denunciation culture, or the so-called snitching system. Like many people told me that they couldn't trust anyone in the occupation because you don't know if your neighbor is collaborating with the Russian FSB. So many people mentioned that it was like in Stalin's time, because you don't know who you can trust. Maybe your neighbor is working for the FSB. So many people tried to avoid to talk about sensitive political issues, especially about Russia. Here it was at the beginning of the war, there were many protests in Kherson, and not only in Kherson, but other, like Nova Kakhovka, in Kakhovka, there were many protests against the occupation. And at the beginning, the Russian authorities, they let it happen. They let it happen, and they took pictures of many people that were in these protests, and then searched for these people. So I interviewed many people, not many, but maybe 4 people that were in this protest. Russians took a picture, then came after them, and 2 of them were tortured, and the others were interrogated, were beaten. So they used it like these pictures to persecute these people. And the last strategy is the so-called remote adaptation, that you don't remain in the territory, you don't stay in the territory, but somehow you resist against the occupation. So how was that? Many, for instance, many universities, like I mentioned, 11 universities, they moved from the occupied territories to Ukrainian-controlled territories. And until now, they are operating there. So I went to Ivano-Frankivsk because there, the State University of Kherson moved from Kherson to Ivano-Frankivsk. So many teachers are there. The directors are working there. I think it was a strategy of resilience, a strategy to fight the occupation remotely. No? The Kherson National Technical University also moved from them. The University of Mariupol now is operating in Kyiv. So it's a strong form of resilience and a way to fight the occupation. And there are many students from these universities, they are now in the occupied territories. And it's really dangerous for them. Of course, they don't say it to anyone, but they are attending Ukrainian universities online from the occupied territories. It also happens to schools. For example, in Nova Kakhovka, there were 11 schools. 9 of these 11 schools, they continued to exist online. So the school directors, the school principals, they are in other regions of Ukraine. Their students are across the Ukraine, are in other countries, and some students, some official reports say that there are nearly 40,000 students in occupied territories that attended these Ukrainian schools online. And of course, it's really dangerous, like Russian officials, sometimes they make searches in the houses, and so the children, they have to hide that they are attending a Russian school, an Ukrainian school, and sometimes they have to go to a Russian school, and at the same time, they go to Ukrainian online schools. I think this is the most promising strategies in terms of coping with the war impact. You face like low risks. You keep like secure linkage with Ukrainian state bureaucracy, and it's I think a strong possibility to save community networks. So there are many schools, for example, from Nova Kakhovka, that they are operating, for example, from Kyiv, but their former students, they are still connected to them. Some of them are in Poland, in Germany, in Moldova, and some in occupation. So the school is a way for the community to keep united, even in the face of a war, even in the face of this huge crisis. Like the main difficulties of the situation, it's the dependence on resource and effective coordination between the institutional managers, the Ukrainian national bureaucracy, and students. If the school principal started to collaborate, it's very hard to keep it working. Some practical issues like internet blocking in occupation. All the time, Russia is trying to block Ukrainian websites, threats to students and their families. So the FSB can call the families if they know that the children are attending Ukrainian schools. It's almost impossible in rural areas. Like I took a couple interviews with people in small villages, and they told me that during the 9 months of occupation, they didn't have any access to internet. They didn't have even water or gas. So maybe in cities, it's easier to have these strategies, but in small villages, it was almost impossible. And teachers in these small villages, they couldn't receive their salaries too. I mentioned to you that people in Kherson city, for example, they could receive their salaries, but in small villages, it was nearly impossible. So we have, maybe it's the next step of my research is to show the difference between how the occupation was faced in the big towns and in the small villages. Like there was strong difference in the occupied territories. Law of availability of resource for teachers and school staff to migrate to another region. As I mentioned to you, if you don't have relatives in another region, if you don't have enough resource, it's very difficult to move from the occupation. I heard of cases that from people that moved from the occupation, they couldn't afford the costs and they are now returning to the occupation because it's the only option they have. And some doubts concerning its sustainability in the long run. The school principals that I interviewed, they mentioned that even new students are entering each year. But I don't think that it will be, in the long run, it will be sustainable because children want to go to offline schools, so they don't want to spend all their life in online schools. Actually, there are many children that are, like for example, in Poland and Germany, and even in the occupation, they are attending offline schools, and at the same time they are attending the online school. But for children, you can imagine that it's really hard, like to have two schools at the same time. Here is the University of Kherson. They received a building from a university in Ivano-Frankivsk, and now they have two buildings there in Ivano-Frankivsk. They received another building. This is the rector of the university, Alexander Spivakovsky. He's very engaged, like he's very motivated in resisting the occupation. Like he's very proud of his resilience, like in trying to. His work is an attempt to fight like the Russian occupation, and he showed me like how when the Russians came to Kherson, they were looking after him. So, and he has a smart house. He was not anymore in Kherson, but he has images of the FSB and National and the Rosgvardia, the Russian police, like entering his house with masks, like looking after him. So, and he is now in the Putin's sanction list, like she's searched by Russia. Here I took it from the Facebook because many schools online, they have like pages in Facebook. I think it's really, how can I say, dangerous because here I try to hide the face of the children, but on Facebook it's completely available, no? And some of these children are in occupation. So I think these schools, they should be more careful with these images. But if you will enter on their pages on Facebook, you will see that you can find like their face. So these were the four strategies. Some brief discussions like the adoption of different strategies based on complex calculus of costs and benefits, personal cultural values, worldviews, expectations of war outcomes. The street-level bureaucrats, they are crucial for territorial control and the sense of political normality, stability, and power legitimation. So Russians, they want the street-level bureaucrats working for them to show that they have some kind of legitimation in the territory, that life is becoming normal in the occupation. And the street-level bureaucrats, they must choose a side. There are profound risks in the choice and moral dilemmas. Even no-action is a stance, is a political side. No? As I mentioned to you, the occupiers, they used coercion and cooptation strategies. They had a very big know-how from Donbass and Crimea. So in Donbass and Crimea, like they took years to implement the things that I mentioned to you. But once they learned a lot in Donbass and Crimea, in the new occupied territories, they introduced it really, really fast. So if they spent like 2 years to do this in Donbass, In the new territories, they spent like 6 months. And I think that this research maybe can be useful for other conflicts and crises around the globe too. Here's the summary of everything that I mentioned to you. It's also in the paper. Some caveats of the research, like the snowball methods and the generalizability of the findings, like there is the risk of bias. Like many people that I interviewed, one recommended another, so it's the snowball method. It's not the best method, but in the face of a war, that when you interview people, the people must trust you, and they only trust you depending on the people that recommended you. So it's very useful. It's not the best method, but for studying a war, it's the best, I think, the best method. I want to explore now other fields like the healthcare system, the emergency workers, the social workers. I also want to study other regions of Ukraine, like study more Kharkiv, especially, and Zaporizhia. Other kinds of conflicts. I think that research in the future may be used to other kinds of conflicts like interstate and intrastate wars, other actors, state and non-state actors, and the territorial configuration. As I mentioned to you, maybe there are a strong difference between urban areas and rural villages. Other insights from the research, not now from the field research that I did during the 3 weeks in Ukraine. Many people mentioned that the levels of threat and violence were higher during the rotations. Like there were Russian officials in the occupation, people from FSB, Rosgvardia, and other Russian security agents, and sometimes they changed every 15 days, for example, they changed the staff. And when the new staff comes, they are really more violent because they want to show to Moscow that they are doing a good job. So they have to send people to prison. So when there are the rotations there, the life is really hard. The other thing that I noticed during the field research is the different grades of war perception. So you have a perception of the war in Western Ukraine, like the war is far. You face the war when you read. When I was there, I could hear like the alarm, air raid alarm. It was the only time that I could see in Ivano-Frankivsk, Lviv. The only time I saw the war, it was with the alarms and the pictures of the soldiers that died. There, in some squares, you can find like many pictures of the soldiers that died in the front. When you go to Central Ukraine, you feel that the war is closer because in Kiev, for example, in 2 days there were really strong bombings by drones, and sometimes the drones they drop bombs. So in Central Ukraine, I could notice that it was the perception of the war was completely different from Western Ukraine. Eastern and Southern Ukraine, like the front regions. When I went to Mykolaiv and very close to the front, it was another perception of the war because you can see you go across the city, you can see many destroyed buildings. Like all the time, people are more afraid because if there will be some air raid alarm, you have only 20 or 30 seconds to go to the shelter, so you don't have any time to escape from the attack. Then you have the 0 point towns, like in Ukraine, like Mykolaiv, it's 50 kilometers from the front. But in Ukraine, they call it front, like front region, not? But what in English we call like the front, in Ukraine they call the 0 point towns. Like Kherson is the zero. The towns that are exactly in the front. So this is even more dangerous than the front region because they like in Kherson you have artillery attacks all the time. I tried to get the accreditation to go to Kherson. I asked to the Ukrainian army, they refused. They told that it's really, really dangerous. They only give it to journalists and they don't give it to researchers. But unfortunately, I was in Mykolaiv, so some people from Kherson came to me and they could do the research there. Then we have the occupied territories near to the front. And we have the occupied territories far from the front. There are two completely different experiences of the war. Like, for example, in Novakhovka, that is near to the front, it's a 0-point town, but it's in the occupation. The Russians, they only managed to open one school because there is too dangerous for the Russian army, for the Russian authorities. So they didn't try to implement all the Russian programs too strong, no? But in the occupied territories that are far from the front, that the Ukrainian army can't hit them, it was easier for them to implement like the Russification programs. So if you go to Ukraine, you'll see that there are many degrees of the war depending on where you are. As I mentioned, there are the difference between 0-point front and occupation, difference between urban and rural areas during the invasion. As I mentioned to you, people live in villages, they didn't have any access to internet, they didn't have any access to energy, so they couldn't receive the salaries from the Ukrainian side. Another thing that I noticed, that there are few men from my age, like from 25 to 45 years on the street. It's really hard to find. I was stopped twice in the streets, like people, soldiers, they were verifying my passport and they laughed when they saw the passport in Brazil. And one time it was really scared because a bus stopped. Then a guy left. I didn't understand what was that. I just went away. Then a soldier left the bus and showed me the credentials and asked my passport. So maybe if I would not have the passport, I would be in the front now. You can see that there are many families divided by the front. So many people have relatives in the occupation, so they still have some kind of contact, but they avoid to talk about sensitive issues because they are afraid of what can happen to them. There are many people with relatives in Russia, and they just lost the contact because many people in Russia were saying, like their relatives in Russia were saying, oh, there is no war, it's fake news, or we are coming to liberate you, like all the Russian propaganda. So families that have like Russian relatives, many families had this division. There are many families that was divided by the migration, like many men, they can't leave Ukraine, but their women, their wives are in Europe. And I heard about many cases that the level of divorce is really high because many people that are abroad, they don't plan to come back to Ukraine in the maybe 10 years. So the level of divorce of people, like men stayed in Ukraine and the wives are abroad with their children, they don't plan to come back. So the level of divorce is high. Another source of the levels of divorce is the, I forgot the name in English, the post-traumatic trauma.
PTSD?
Yes, like many soldiers, they come back from the front with a very aggressive way of behavior. So there are many cases of domestic violence and divorce because these people, they can't live normally anymore. They have very aggressive behavior. Another interesting thing during the interview was the gender difference in the perception of the war. Like I interviewed a couple of teachers, both were teachers. The man, he continued to work, and the woman, she stopped to work because she was really concerned about their child. Their child was really scared. he didn't want to leave the house, like for almost for 5 months. He stayed inside the house, and he didn't want that his mother leave the house. So she was really concerned by the life and the emotions of her child. So you can see like the role of the woman, like the preoccupation with the child really, really strong. And she was doing everything for the emotional stability of her child, like trying to making him feel comfortable all the time. And other women that I interviewed, they have like the same perception, like how to show to my children that we can live normally. So you can see during the interview this gender difference. Like I don't think many men were really had the same degree of preoccupation with their children. At least they didn't show it in the interviews. Another interesting thing, like the Ukrainian voices and polarization. In Brazil, we are talking a lot, not talking a lot, I'm a part of a minority in Brazil. Unfortunately, there are many scholars that think that Russian occupation is good, like in Ukraine there are many Nazis, NATO is the reason of the war. So this bullshit that you heard about. And I'm a part of a minority then, and we are like trying to bring Ukrainian voices to Brazil. But at the same time, I met during my interviews like Ukrainian voices that were kind of similar to the Russian voice, like saying, "Oh, Zelensky is controlled by Russia. This is not this is a war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia and the United States own Ukrainian territory." So many things like connected maybe to Russian propaganda. But am I in a position to choose this Ukrainian voice is valuable, this other Ukrainian voice is not valuable? This is a really complex issue, how to address these issues. But I did these interviews, and I have to take them into account. Another interesting issue, the use of the Russian language. So the Russian propaganda says that the Russian language is forbidden in Ukraine. Now you can be prosecuted for speaking Russian. And in Kiev, maybe most people that I saw in the streets, they were talking in Russian. Maybe with me, they talked in Ukrainian, but I could notice that among themselves, they were speaking in Russian. In Mykolaiv, the same. And in Odessa, even more, maybe 90% of the population. I wrote to the hotel in Ukrainian. They answered to me in Russian. And according to the Ukrainian law, they were supposedly obliged to answer me in Ukrainian, but they don't observe them. They just answered me in Russian. Another interesting issue was the closure of the USAID. I met people from many social organizations, many NGOs, for example, Anna Novasad. She's former Ministry of Education. She has a very interesting project building shelters in schools closer to the front, because people close to the front, they haven't attended the school during the last, 4 years, because before there was COVID. So they want like to come back to normal life, to go to school. But in Ukraine, if you want to go to school, the school must have a shelter. And many schools close to the front, they don't have a shelter, so they can't have offline classes. And this project by Anna Novosad addressed this issue. So they are trying to build shelters in the schools. I will show some pictures. I went to some of these shelters. They are really, really good. But because of USAID, many social projects like that were halted. So many Ukrainian NGOs are now facing a huge problem because of the closure of the USAID. And lastly, some personal experience, like I think nationalism is not very noticeable on streets. Before coming to Ukraine, I was wondering that a country in war, what will I find? Like many flags everywhere? No, and I didn't. I came like to my first city was Lviv, and I thought that I would see flags everywhere. And I don't know, maybe in Berlin I saw more Ukrainian flags than in Lviv. No? So I don't think the war provoked like a really strong nationalism. Is there a feeling of resilience, a feeling of fighting, but not a chauvinist nationalism? Talking to Ukrainian, I could notice that this is not only a war of defense, but also a war of national liberation. So like Russia never accepted their country as independent, and now they are fighting to be independent. You can notice a strong feeling of resilience. So many Ukrainians, they saw them when I asked, how is the situation here? How you are facing that? They just answered, "Треба жити." No? We need to live. No? We have to find some way to copy with this. The psychological impact, like I spent only three weeks there. Almost every day there were air raid alarms on drone attacks. So I came back from Ukraine, but until now, when I heard some strong sound, automatically I think that I remember that, oh, maybe it's the air bomb alarm, not? So I spent only 3 weeks. Imagine people that are 3 years in the war, not? So 3 weeks, I can think, maybe after 1 month, I will not be concerned. But every time that I heard some alarm on the street, I remember the war. No? As I mentioned to you, when I was doing interviews online in Brazil, interviewing tortured people is emotionally really hard. Like what they were telling to me was not new. I had read about that. But when you face these people, it's really hard. And when you meet them, you interview them in the destroyed village, you look across the window and you can see like the destroyed school, it's emotionally really strong. Like I couldn't sleep for some days. Here I mentioned to you the verification of the documents because I'm in the military recruitment age. And the destroyed buildings that I mentioned to you, like the regions that were under occupation, they faced less destruction because the Ukrainian army didn't hit like the civilian targets. At the beginning, I thought that this was only a propaganda of Ukrainian. No, we are better. We are not bomb like civilian areas. But when I went there, I could check that it was true. Like the occupied areas are much more preserved than the areas that were under the Ukrainian control close to the front. As I mentioned, I've been to 2 villages that were completely like 80% destroyed. I have some pictures here for you. This is the school that was destroyed. Like I was interviewing the school principal and looking at the window and across the window, we could see the destroyed school. This is the same building. Close to the village, there are many mine fields, and it was like, I don't know, I think 20 meters from the village. So if a child leave the space of the village, he or she can like find a minute field. There are some foreign NGOs that are working on this field, trying to search for the mines, but it will take more than 10 years to resolve this problem. In the Mykolaiv region, in this region that I heard of 30 cases of accidents with mines. Some of them, I think 5, involving children. And there are not only this kind of mines, but also the mines that I mentioned to you from the fragmentation bombs. Some of them are still spread over the territories, and until now, they are finding this mine. Here was, this was Oleg Pilipenko, he's the mayor of Shevchenkov. He was arrested and tortured by the Russians at the beginning of the invasion because he was like sending coordinates of the Russian troops to the Ukrainian army, and they found it in his cell phone when he was stopped. So he was tortured and sent. He spent like 3 months in prison, and then he was changed for a Russian soldier that was captive. And this place is the place where he was first tortured. So he took me to the place where he had his first interrogatory. This is in the village of Shevchenkov, the village that I mentioned to you. This village was exactly in the front. So most of the houses until now are destroyed. They are trying to recover the village, but you can see that it's really, really harmed. This is in Bucha. So Bucha, if you go now, it's a completely new city. Like it's a very beautiful city because Bucha is quite famous around the world, so they received many foreign aid. But you can still find like houses like that in some neighborhoods in Bucha. Like this is a church in Bucha. You can see the marks of the weapons. This is a car cemetery in Bucha as well. I think there were like 150 cars here and many people died in these cars. As I mentioned to you, at the beginning of the war, people that were trying to escape from the occupation to non-occupied territory, they were hit by gunmen and bombs. And these are the cars that were hit related to the people that were trying to escape from the occupation. As I mentioned to you, escaping from occupation was really, really risky. This is a cemetery in Bucha. They accounted like more than 500 victims there, and there are nearly 40 people that they don't know. They just have the number. They are still trying to identify who are these people. So they are buried there. This is the part of the cemetery that they don't know who are these people. So they just have the numbers. And until now, they are like making analysis, doing analysis, trying to know who are these people. 2 weeks ago, they managed to identify 2, but there are nearly 40 people that haven't been identified. And this was really emotional for me too, because in Brazil, there are many people that say that Bucha was an invention by Western media to make a commotion, like to Fabio, my colleague from Brazil, he knows about the bullshit that we have to hear every day. Here is in Kiev. I mentioned that in Kiev, I didn't see many buildings destroyed, but in some neighborhoods, you can see some buildings as well. Here's in the Maidan Nезалежность. So each flag is for a deaf soldier. So you can see like how many flags, how many people died in the war. I mentioned to you that in Ivano-Frankivsk, the only perception of the war that I had was the air alarms, and this, they call it Kubik. So it's the portrait of people that died during the soldiers that died. And like there were maybe more than 1 kilometer of pictures of people that died and people that are from Ivano-Frankivsk. You know? So you see the war there when you look at these pictures. And the most impressive for me was that most of the soldiers, they were from the same year of mine, like 1989. I think there was a range maybe from 1982 to 1999, and my age was exactly the most common age of the people that died. This is a shelter built by the organization of Novosad, like with the financing from the USA, they built many shelters like that, really, really nice shelters. Like these shelters can receive 1,000 students. Like it's a huge shelter. But many projects like that will not be implemented anymore. And my last picture, I chose this picture because you can see the resilience of the Ukrainians. Like they can smile even facing all this tragedy, all this difficult life. They are still smiling. And I think this is a kind of resilience. Thank you very much for your assistance, for your attention. And I'm sorry that I talked a lot. And if you have any questions, I don't know if you have time. Here, you have my contact. I have the paper that I wrote about the teachers. I have the preprint version. It's still not published, but I can share it with you, the preprint version as well, and other papers about the war that I have too. Thank you.
Please, questions, comments.
Yeah, so
You can start.
okay, thanks. Hello. I wanted to say like a few remarks. First of all, thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting because I'm a Ukrainian, so it's interesting to see how you. I'm an anthropologist, so doing field. From Irpin. That's what I wanted to. Yeah, that I wanted to offer. Firstly, another interpretation why Bucha and Irpin also look like a new town. It's also because they're quite new. So the median age of people who were there was quite low, and therefore like people who resided there were mostly middle urban class. That's like, I mean, aside from the part of the media coverage, it's just that a lot of people have returned because they bought those flats quite recently. That's another factor, and that there are actually a lot of displaced people who moved there because it's much more affordable to move in Bucha, Irpin, and commute to Kyiv than to live in Kyiv itself. So that's why I wanted to add to your interpretation why Bucha looks like a new town. And secondly, I wanted to ask whether you could contact those schools, maybe, and try to explain them that maybe they shouldn't post children online because I am afraid they're not big on cybersecurity or in any kind of security. So I was wondering if you could, I mean, that would be really nice if you could just like text them and say like, hey, I understand you just don't know this, but please stop posting their faces. Yes, that was the second remark, that it would be really good if you could do it because they probably just don't understand what is at stake. And third, I was wondering if you like studied how those Russian teachers who came to like occupied territories, how they interacted with Ukrainian teachers, or like whether any kind of connect, like were they trying to impose, and overall if there was just like Russian teachers coming from Russia, what was the interaction like, and any information? And also I thought that maybe some of the teachers, they would collaborate per se, but then the content of the lesson itself might not have been really what Russian officials would want it to be. And I was wondering, do you have any note on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, my apologies because I think that the car cemetery was in Irpin. I mentioned that I mentioned it was in Bucha. Actually, people took me to Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel.
Yeah, they are conglomerates.
For me, it was not clear where the border was because it looked like one single city. So it was not easy to know if am I in Irpin or Bucha. But actually,
but there are fresh cemeteries in Bucha as well, so that's
but regarding the teachers, how they reacted, how they connected to Russian teachers, I really wanted to do this interview, but it's really hard to interview people that, because if they mention that, they are admitting that they were collaborators.
Yeah.
And there is a huge stigma in Ukraine now. So even if they collaborated, if they met Russian teachers, I don't think they would tell it to me. So maybe some of the people that I interviewed, they had this contact, but they hid it from me. No? But I agree with you. It would be very interesting to find some way to contact these people. But I don't know how. I went to Ukraine because when I was interviewing people online, I could notice that some people were scared, not because of me, but they think that someone could be listening to them. And not only Russians, but also SBU, not the Ukrainians. So they were afraid of telling something that could be used against them even by the Ukrainian government. So I went there expecting that people were going to be more confident. They were more confident. I got much more information than I got online, but at the same time, I didn't have any case of people that collaborated. On the other hand, people were always trying to show that they resisted the occupation, that they were brave. So maybe, I don't know if this is the true history or not. This is the history that they want me to know, but maybe it was not completely exactly in this situation. But I agree. The only source of information that I had, it was like the Russian newspapers. It was like a propaganda, RIA Novosti, no, Komsomolskaya Pravda. But at the same time, you saw by the quotation that they were giving really rich information that people didn't want to collaborate. But I don't know how to reach these people, but I have to find some way to. But thank you for your commentary. It's really interesting.
Thank you. So first, again, like, thank you very much, because I found this as like a very, very, very important and very like insightful also. I am from Colombia. I mean, a country that have been in war for more than 60 years now. But and I was thinking while you were speaking all the time that that I have like this question about like peace building efforts within the war and like within like these communities that you research, because I think like in Colombia there are many positions about the inner war that we still have. But when you go and you speak with the people, that is like that, I feel is kind of what you did with this research, or what you are doing, that you go and you speak with the people that is like directly living the war. Because in our case, like the war is they fight the war in the rural areas, no in the cities. I mean, we are still affected, but no way similar to the rural areas. So when you go there and you speak with the people that is like being directly affected by this, like they usually say that what they want is like the war to stop. Like that's the first thing. Like, I mean, like, we don't care like who is in power or who wins or who stop the war, and then we can care about other things. So yes, so I was wondering, like, also because you work with teachers, professors that work with kids, and I remember I was a psychologist, and I was working with kids in Colombia when the war in Ukraine became like this big news around the world. And I remember I had kids in that moment that were super scared of leaving their home and leaving their parents, because they thought like an atomic bomb was going to, like, because they're like, adults speak and adults are afraid and they transmit like these fears. So like there was like a very like a very like hard work that we needed to do, like with the kids, about like speaking like about how they could understand war, but also how they could understand peace, and like how yes, I think it's just like too much that I have to say. I don't think I will be able to say everything, but I think that like in Colombia, the efforts, like because you mentioned it, like they don't know like if this war is going to be for 5 years, 10 years, 100 years. But I think that like the peace efforts that are finally having some effects in my country are mostly because the generations that are now leading these peace efforts like mine are generations that were like we were born in a country in war. So it's like we are generations that we don't want to die without experiencing a Colombia in peace. So I do think like the work of the education professionals is key in that possibility. Yes. So if you have something to say about that.
Thank you very much. It was not a question from my questionnaire. Like I asked people informally if they support negotiations talks, if they think that Ukraine has to make some agreement with Russia. I was talking it more informally. It was not part of my questionnaire, but I talked with people about it. And most of the people, especially those that live under occupation, I have the feeling that they are less prone to negotiations with Russia because they think that Russia will not respect any negotiation, and they are really afraid that they will become under occupation again. So especially in the village, in the region of Mykolaiv, they told me that it was like life there was really, really tough. Like one teacher mentioned to me that the soldier mentioned that if I receive an order to shoot in everyone here, I will not think twice. So this is the way that the soldiers there in this village was treating them. I don't know. I have the impression, maybe I'm wrong, but I have the impression that the occupation in the village was really, really different from the cities, because in the village, maybe in Kherson, what was happening in the Kherson city, the world was seeing, like people were sending messages through WhatsApp and Telegram. But what was happening there in this small village in Mykolaiv, no one was seeing. There was no internet signal. So I think Russian soldiers, they felt themselves much more comfort to make abuses there. So that's why they were threatening to shoot everyone. They said that after 8 p.m., if you will be on the street, you will be shot. So I really think that people in these areas, they have a really strong anti-Russian sentiment now, and they don't think that Russia is trustable and accountable to have any kind of negotiation now. But people far from the front, I talked to them, and some of them think that, yes, we need negotiations now. Some of them, they have children in the front, so they were like divided. Yes, we need negotiations, but Ukraine must be listened, not Trump's negotiations. I was there when Trump like humiliated Zelensky. You know? I was talking to Ukrainian teachers, and my mother was calling me, telling what happened, and I told you, I opened like all the Brazilian newspapers. It was like on the front page, and I mentioned to the teacher what happened. She looked at in the Ukrainian website and she started to cry. Like it was really tough. She started like to cry, and she said that she doesn't like Zelensky, but it's not Trump's choice. So she supports Zelensky against Trump, and she thinks that Ukraine must be listened in the negotiations, not like Trump, not Trump, but his representatives went to Saudi Arabia to meet Russian representatives, and Zelensky knew it on television, like he was not informed. So I could notice that there was many people don't like Zelensky, but they still support. They think that it's their choice like to have Zelensky as a president. It's not Trump's choice, and so maybe the popularity of Zelensky rose after the Trump scandal. No? But I think that there is a strong discussion now. Do we need agreement? Is it possible to have any agreement with Russia now? Is Russia accountable for our agreement? Like, we need not only an agreement, but realistic security guarantees. Otherwise, Russia will only use this time to get stronger and conduct a new invasion. But it's a really complex issue. I recently wrote about that to a Brazilian newspaper, that we are not in a position to evaluate that. It's a decision by the Ukrainian people. So I mean, as a Brazilian, I can't say that Ukrainian must go to negotiation or not. I think this is a decision for you, like Ukrainian people has to think about what you want to concede, what you don't want to concede. But sorry, I don't have a clear answer to that.
Thank you.
I have a quick question about internet in these occupied territories. Is it who provides this internet? Is it just a Russian provider, or maybe it's Starlink or what?
Russian providers, and people use VPN to access Russian websites.
VPN for getting safe info.
For reaching Ukrainian websites.
For reaching Ukrainian websites. And Russians do not shut internet, so they occupy. But you said that during the kind of the occupation of Bucha, internet didn't work. Like during the invasion.
At the beginning, even in Kherson, they could everything. At the beginning, it was a huge internet blockade, because they were afraid that people were sending the coordinates of the Russian troops to the Ukrainian army. So they did a huge blockade. But many people told me that they went like to the last floor of the building or to some hill, to some mountain to get the signal from the Ukrainian mobile phones they could reach.
That would be Starlink, I guess. That would be Starlink.
No, they didn't mention the Starlink. I don't think. I don't know how the Starlink.
No, because Starlink comes from the sky.
Yeah, it was supposed to work, no? But no Ukrainian mentioned the Starlink.
But okay, but like you have to trying to understand the Russian strategy in respect to the internet. So they turn off the internet during the kind of the first stage of the occupation, like for weeks or for months.
Per month.
For months.
And in the villages, maybe more than 7 months even. So the blockade in the villages was even stronger than in the cities.
And then they turn it back on, like to normalize life or what, like because that would be safer for them probably to keep it shut.
Yeah, but now it is working.
I think it was in summer 22 already. They kind of directed it through the Russian servers and switched it on. And so I remember reading also some Western publications about this.
Yes, I knew people that they, for example, they still have a house in the occupation and they pay like for neighbors to take care of the house. So they have contacts. They are still in touch. There are many people, maybe half of the people that I interviewed, they have relative or parents in the occupation, and they are still in contact. But people there in occupation tell that no one supports, like most people don't support the Russians. They are only awaiting for the liberation. Oh, I mentioned to you about the universities that are operating like in other regions, but the cities, like the mayors, they are from the occupied territories, they are also working in other cities. For example, I did an interview with the mayor of Kakhovka. It's a city occupied in the Kherson region, and he's working now in Kiev. In Kiev, there is a place called Kherson Hub. So it's like a headquarters there from the Kherson administration, and there are 3 majors from occupied territories that are working in Kiev, and they provide like humanitarian assistance to people from Kherson that are now as refugees in Kiev. So I think that all the cities in Kherson that are occupied now, they still have a mayor that is working in Ukrainian-controlled territories, trying like to provide educational service, humanitarian aid to people from Kherson that moved from the occupation. And in Kiev, I went to there was an exhibition in a cinema in a movie theater there about the explosion of the dam of Kakhovka. I don't know if you remember the fact that Russians, they exploded and there was a documentary there. And some people from Kiev were asking, oh, but they are now in the occupation, they support the Russians. No, why they didn't swim into the Ukrainian side? And people from Kherson, they got really nervous because they know that many people, they don't have other choice. They have their reasons to be in the occupation. So you can see that even in Kiev, there is prejudice against people that are in occupation. I think many people just think if they are there in the occupation, they are supporting the Russians. It's their problem to be there.
Another question, please.
I have a quick question. So when you talk to the people there, was there any report that about the Russians trying to kind of whitewash what was happening in the occupied areas, or pretending the life in occupied areas was better, trying to use it as propaganda or something like that?
Good question and difficult.
I remember seeing videos from Mariupol, and then the Russians showing the new buildings that they were building. It's like, oh, life here is amazing, actually, and all this new development. But I haven't seen a lot of that, and because there isn't a lot of pressure, or there is insufficient pressure against them, it doesn't seem that they have to do it, which is unfortunate. So I was wondering if
I don't know, but I have the feeling that this whitewashing was more to people outside the occupation than to people. They were not interesting because people that were there in occupation, they could see that it was bullshit. No? So it was more addressed to people maybe outside Ukraine or outside the occupation. But there was a case, I interviewed the director of the University of Mariupol, and he mentioned that Mariupol was a really developed city in Donbass because Ukraine wanted to show to the Russian-controlled Donbass that they would be better off under the Ukrainian control. So they received a lot of investment. So like Mariupol was a really beautiful city, well-developed city, like to be like as a vitrine to the other Donbass. And many people from the other Donbass came to Mariupol and they could see that life in Mariupol was much better than in the other Donbass. But I interviewed people from Donbass. They had like some visions very similar to the Russia propaganda. And they noticed, no, and they just mentioned, oh, life in Donbass is nice. Now we have roads, everything is working. Maybe I will come back there in the future. I don't think that people in Donbass now, they want to return to Russia. So I had this kind of conversation with some people from Donbass. But there are many people from Donbass that they have completely the other view. Sorry.
That wasn't the question. I just wanted to add up that I think that like looking at what the reasons why it's not that possible to whitewash the Russian occupation should be looked at directly as an aftermath of DNR-LNR situation, because Crimea went kind of smoother-ish, and people, I mean, it wasn't that smooth, but it was smoother, but people who have been living under occupation of DNR, LNR already faced tremendous consequences because they were not integrated into Russia as they were promised. They were not, I mean, people left to Ukraine, some of them, and the region just started disintegrating for these 10 years. And in those 10 years, I mean, it was 8, you could clearly see that. That's why I think that why the peace negotiations and why they don't want to go anywhere is because everyone has a relative who has been living in DNR, LNR, and who cannot afford even a laundry detergent. So it's a very, I do think that if they were to do it before, maybe there would be more hesitancy. But because it has been for 8 years and they haven't done anything for the most part of population for DNR, LNR, Crimea is a separate situation. I think that most of Ukrainians just have a very life, I mean, an answer tied to the lives of your